There we go. Hello. Welcome back. Happy Thursday. Hope your week is going well. So today, as you can see behind me, we are going to shift from talking about things that are kind of negative, right? Like prejudice, like aggression, over to some of the more positive aspects of social psychology. And we're going to start by talking about relationships and things like attraction and intimacy, which is why the question today had to do with what traits you value in a romantic partner. So I'm seeing humor a lot. I'm seeing trust, honesty, and so forth. Definitely, things that many people find important. So let's just quickly go over an overview of the day. Before I do that, I'm going to shut my door real quick, so I'm not too loud in here. All right, so today we're going to start talking about attraction and intimacy. We'll define what intimate relationships are. We'll talk about this universal need to belong that we have as humans. We'll talk about what leads to attraction, some different things that lead to relationships forming. From there, we'll talk about like physical attraction, some gender differences there. If we have time for it, we'll start talking about love and what love is. Is love even something that we can define? According to social psychology, yes. So we'll get into all that. Just some quick reminders for you above. Office hours via WebEx, virtual office hours, every Monday and Wednesday from 3 to 4 p.m. There is the link above. Put that in your bookmarks or whatever and log in during that hour to get your questions answered. Reflection paper number 4, that is due May 7th. The deadline for SONA credit, also May 7th. Definitely get on that if you have not already. And then lastly, the final exam number 3, that is going to be on May 13th. And again, sometime next week you can expect a study outline as I did for the second exam. Hopefully you found that helpful for the second exam. And if so, good news, there's going to be another one for the third exam. So be on the lookout for that. And then, as always, just a quick goal check-in. Hopefully you're keeping up with your personal goal, whatever it may have been. All right, so let's get into it. We've got a lot to cover today, and then, as with every Thursday, there'll be a Kahoot quiz after lecture. All right, so as I mentioned, this next section is all about intimate relationships. So how do they form? How are they sustained? What attracts certain people to other people? So intimate relationships can refer to romantic partnerships, but they're really any sort of close relationship. So friendship, family bonds count here as well. Now at their core, intimate relationships are characterized by high self-disclosure. So clear and consistent communication between two partners in which both people communicate information about themselves. So there's this back and forth of information. Some other components of intimate relationships that are important, having a high knowledge of one another, having strong feelings of caring for another person, or like feelings of commitment. Interdependence is also important. So we define interdependence here as when each person, like what each person does in a relationship, significantly influences what their partner does over long periods of time. Mutuality is also important. So mutuality refers to partners' acknowledgement that their lives are intertwined. And with mutuality, there's a tendency to not think of like me and you, tendency to not think of like two separate individuals, but rather us, right? So like tendency to think of you and your partner as like a cohesive unit rather than two independent individuals acting independently. Trust is a key component of intimate relationships, as is, again, commitment. So partners' investment of time, effort, and resources in their relationship with the expectation that the relationship is going to continue indefinitely. So why do we go about entering into intimate relationships in the first place? Well, it's thought that belonging is one of the fundamental motivations among people. So it's thought to be a universal psychological need, a need to belong. And it truly is a need, and it functions similarly to the way that other needs we have function. So if you think about how our biological needs work, they work on the principle of homeostasis, which is, or that is to say, you experience some deficiency which motivates your thoughts and behaviors until that deficiency is satisfied. So for example, food is a need. We have a need to eat, right? You get hungry because you need food. And that feeling of hunger motivates your behavior. You seek out food and you eat it. And you do so until you're full, at which point you stop eating. Now, this same principle of homeostasis applies to close relationships, our formation of close relationships, and our need to belong. People generally don't need many relationships, just a few that are lasting and caring. And when they have those relationships, they tend to be less motivated to form additional relationships. So you might have several hundred people on your Facebook friends list, but really how many of those are close, continuing, intimate relationships? Most likely not all of them, probably just a handful. So even though this is a need that everyone has, people differ in terms of how strong their need for belonging is. So above me, you can see some items from a scale that measures need to belong. You don't have to memorize any of these items. It's just to give you an indication of what is kind of what this need is made up on, right? So made up of. So strongly agreeing with these items indicates a stronger need to to belong. Forming and maintaining relationships are necessary for our survival, for human survival, and also human well-being. It's easy to see the evolutionary advantages behind belonging to relationships or having a desire to belong to relationships. So forming really close relationships helps groups stick together, helps group cohesion form. And as we talked about when we talked about groups, we know that there's safety in numbers. We can do things that we could not do as individuals when we have these close continuing relationships as part of groups. So forming relationships, it also made it more likely that our evolutionary ancestors were better able to find mates, to have children, and to ensure that those children grew into adulthood. And even today, maintaining positive, long-lasting relationships has been shown to have a host of positive outcomes for people. Now, on the flip side, when this need is not met, it can be really detrimental. So loneliness has potentially major negative repercussions. Being lonely or being socially rejected can make a real negative impact on people. Even minor forms of rejection, like hearing gossip about yourself, can increase stress-related heart activity. It can cause you to be flooded with stress hormones, and so on. So related to that, ostracism, which refers to acts of exclusion, right? To ostracize someone is to kind of socially exclude them, actively avoiding them or giving them the silent treatment or whatever. Ostracism can have really negative impacts on people as well. So we see the effects of it within the brain. Being socially rejected activates the anterior cingulate cortex. This is a region of the brain that, among other things, processes pain. So it processes physical pain, but not only that, it also registers social pain. So in terms of your neurological structures, within your brain, psychosocial pain is on par with physical pain. Now, over time, loneliness can contribute to a host of health complications, such as depressive symptoms, eating disorders, even schizophrenia in people who are vulnerable to that disorder. So being lonely hurts, and people strive to avoid that pain. They strive to form high-quality relationships. But obviously, people don't just form relationships with everyone that they meet, right? We tend to be somewhat selective in who we form relationships with. So how do we go about choosing who to form a relationship with? Either a friendship or a romantic relationship? In the chat, I've already asked you about what sorts of things you look for in a partner. Right, and again, things like, humor was mentioned a lot, trust, being easygoing, having respect, having a good personality, and so forth. So let's look at the research on this to see if that lines up with what researchers have found. So generally speaking, when you ask both men and women this sort of question, people do give fairly similar answers. People tend to like others that are warm and friendly, intelligent, emotionally stable, ambitious in their lives in some way, or even talented in some capacity. Beyond that, people tend to like others for traits that are culturally valued. So for example, in the United States, which is a highly individualistic culture, extroversion is something that is valued by our society. Right? That's because people who are highly extroverted, they have a desire to be gregarious, to stand out, to stand above the rest. These are all really positive things in our society, right? Because again, we value those sorts of things. And so individuals within those societies that value those sorts of things, they tend to highly value extroversion in their partners. So some of these things are culturally influenced in that way. However, there's evidence that people's actual preferences may differ from their reported preferences. Why might that be? Well, maybe it's because some people are reluctant to report, or who maybe they hide what they truly desire because they feel like maybe it's not socially acceptable. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that when thinking about what we desire in a romantic partnership, people may place too much emphasis on dispositional characteristics of another person, right? So when people kind of think about this question, they tend to just think about that other person's personality or their values or their beliefs or whatever. Those are dispositional characteristics. And they tend to not consider as much situational factors surrounding the formation of a relationship. Right, so when we think about who we're more or less likely to form relationships with, we often think about it in terms of qualities that other person has. We often fail to take into account situational variables that influence our likelihood to form a friendship or a romantic relationship with another person. So let's talk about some of those situational aspects, those situational factors that influence who we have or who we form relationships with. So one of these situational factors is proximity, or how close, physically close, someone is to you. When we talk about proximity, or the distance between two people, we can talk about it in two different ways. So first, there's geographical distance. This refers to how far apart two people are from one another, physically. So you and your next door neighbor, for example, the geographical distance between the two of you is quite small. And you can compare that to the other form of proximity, which is functional distance. This refers to how frequently two people come into contact with one another, how often their paths cross. These two types of distance or proximity are related, but functional distance more strongly predicts whether a relationship will form between two people. Now think about why that might be. Let's say someone or two people are really close in geographical distance, right? That does make it more likely that they're also going to be close in functional distance too. If someone is really like physically close to you, more likely it is that you're going to cross paths with them every day, maybe interact with them frequently. But it doesn't always work that way. So for example, I've been living in this particular apartment complex for a few months now. I have a next door neighbor who, again, he's lived next to me for months, but I've only ever seen the guy once, right? So never spoken to him. Our geographical distance is extremely close, but our functional distance is quite far apart. We rarely cross paths. It's like we share a wall, and yet we have no relationship. We are functionally very distant from one another. Actually, it's this wall right next to me that I share with him. He's probably sitting, 10 feet away from me right now. Maybe he can even hear me. Let's hope not. But maybe he can. So again, geographically close, functionally very distant. If you are listening, hello, neighbor. Although I will say, I know very little about this guy. I do know that he really likes bass-heavy house music, just based on how much this wall will shake with, again, bass-heavy house music. Just as I'm sure he knows that, or rather, he's heard plenty of what I'm always blasting, which, if you recall, is the album Astro Lounge by Smash Mouth. Great album, still not ashamed to admit that to you all. But I digress. So when functional distance is high, that means that you're seeing that person frequently. Your paths are crossing. You might be more likely to interact with them more frequently, which results in a higher likelihood of relationships forming. Having a little issue with YouTube here. Let me just see if I can get... Technical difficulty. Okay. For whatever reason, the YouTube studio isn't loading for me. Hopefully this is still going out and you can still see me. I guess we'll find out shortly, if that's not the case. But I'm going to assume you still can hear me, and I'll keep going here. So, okay. Proximity. Talking about proximity here. To demonstrate the relationship between geographical and functional proximity and how they both relate to the likelihood of relationship formation, Leon Festinger and colleagues did a study in which they surveyed MIT undergraduates moving into a new apartment complex. So they found that they were able to predict the likelihood of friendships forming by the end of the year between people living in these apartments based just on how closely people lived to one another within this apartment complex. So the closer that two people lived to one another, the more likely it was that relationships would develop between those two people. Right? And this is based on really nothing but just, again, physical or functional proximity. Now, something worth noting here is that a lot of research on proximity as it relates to relationships, it was done in the mid to late 20th century, right? So this study above, it was published in 1950. It's a long time ago. Do you think that physical proximity makes as much of a difference today in who we form relationships with as it did back then? And just thinking about it, you might argue that with the advent of the internet, like social media sites like Facebook, Twitter, message boards, and so on, all those things have made it possible to form very close, meaningful relationships with people who are geographically very far away. Having said that, though, proximity still does play a big role in who we have relationships with. So you can think about your own experience as undergrads. Think about your first year and your freshman friends, right? Freshman friends, they're people who you form relationships with, sometimes very strong relationships with, during your first year. Usually they're people from your hall in your dorm, or just people who live in your dorm building. Would you have had those same friends if you lived in a different dorm your first year? Honestly, probably not. You probably have a different set of freshman friends. And then the joke with freshman friends is that after your first year ends, you never see 90% of those people again once you move dorms, and you form new relationships, right? Maybe you form new relationships through the clubs you join, or maybe you meet people in classes you take that you form relationships with. Again, those are all relationships that first blossom thanks to physical proximity between you and these other people. Now, one possible explanation for why proximity may be related to relationship formation is something we mentioned earlier in the semester, the mere exposure effect. So, the mere exposure effect, if you recall, this is a tendency for a novel stimulus to be liked more or rated more positively after the rater has been repeatedly exposed to it. So in other words, it refers to a tendency to like things or prefer things that we are familiar with. So Zients did a study in which he showed a series of pictures. And each of these pictures had a male face on it, right? So he showed this series of pictures to participants. Some of the faces were shown a frequent number of times, while other faces were only shown once or twice. And then sometime later, Zients asked participants to rate their attitudes toward the faces in the picture, right? So how do you feel about this person? And he'd, show each one of the pictures they'd been exposed to one after another. Participants tended to have much more favorable attitudes to faces that they had seen more frequently compared to those that they did not see frequently. So two people that are functionally close to one another are likely to see one another more often, right? And maybe that makes it more likely that they're going to kind of like one another more often, which makes it more likely that they'll start talking to one another. And, that will lead to a more long-lasting relationship. So that's one possible explanation as to why proximity has this influence on relationships. And also, thank you for those in the chat, letting me know that you can still see and hear me. I'll keep that in mind when Firefox crashes again and I'm closed out of YouTube. All right, so next, let's talk about romantic partnerships specifically. There are two truisms that we have in our culture about what makes a good romantic partner. These are sayings about relationships that you've probably heard a lot in your lifetime, and they both say completely opposite things. So opposites attract, meaning that people are going to be most attracted to and happy with people who are dissimilar to them. That's one thing that we hear a lot about, relationship formation. Another thing we hear, though, is birds of a feather flock together, meaning that people are going to be most attracted to and happy with people who are more similar to them. Right, so we hear both these things a lot. They both mean different things. Which one of them is true? Do people fare better with people who are similar to them or people who are dissimilar to them? Thinking about your own relationships or the relationships of other people in your life, like your friends or your parents. Which of these do you find more truth in? So there has been some research looking into this. And looking at this research on romantic relationships, the data seem to support the notion that people tend to prefer partners who are more similar to them than dissimilar. So it seems like birds of a feather flock together is, of the two, of the two truisms, the more accurate one for the most part. And we'll talk about some caveats to that. But so, for example, if you're someone who is very thrifty and highly values fiscal responsibility, you're probably not going to have a great time in a long-term relationship with someone who spends a lot of their money. Married partners in that particular kind of situation, they tend to report more conflict, reduced marital well-being, and so on. So again, similarity between two partners pays off there. Even before a relationship starts between two people, we tend to be attracted to people who are more similar to us. People tend to like others who share the same opinions and values that they do. We even see this preference in infants. So in one study by Mahajan and Wynn, babies were more likely to prefer a stuffed animal that pretended to eat the same food that they did and wear the same color clothes that they did. So this is something that starts very early in our lives. Or you could think back to research on the chameleon effect, right? Where people who behave in the same way as their conversation partners, even in subtle ways with subtle body movements or body language and positioning, they tend to be better liked by their conversation partners. Now, something worth noting is that research suggests that there's a stronger relationship between perceived similarity and liking than there is between objective or actual similarity and liking. So what are the differences between perceived similarity and objective similarity? Well, let's talk about similarity in personality. If you were to measure two people's personalities, right, their likes and dislikes, their attitudes, their beliefs, and so on, let's say we were to give them each of those people a measure of personality to fill out, and then if you were to look at how they scored on those assessments and then compared those scores mathematically, that would be a measure of objective similarity, right? If they scored very similarly on those personality assessments, they would be said to have very highly objectively similar personalities. So that's objective similarity. Objective similarity is predictive of attraction and liking. So the more objectively similar someone is to you, the more likely it is you'll like them. However, what's even more important than that is perceived similarity. So if I were, what this refers to is, if I were to not measure you and your partner's personality with an objective questionnaire, if I were just to ask you, how similar do you feel like you are to your romantic partner? Your answer would be your perceived similarity to them, your own ideas about how similar your likes and dislikes, your personality, your values, and other things are. Many times, perceived similarity differs from objective similarity. So someone might have a person in their lives who is similar to them in almost every way, but that person is that person is nothing like me, right? Even though maybe an outsider might look at them both and say well, you do have a lot in common. Or maybe the opposite is true, right? Where people feel like they're very similar or have a lot in common with someone who, in actuality, maybe they don't. Perceived similarity predicts liking and attraction much more strongly than objective or actual similarity does. That's the takeaway from this line of research. So that's research on birds of a feather flocking together. Whoops. Seems like my PowerPoint has abruptly switched over. Okay, there we go. Not time for the Kahoot just yet. So what about that other saying, right? Opposites attract. How true is that? Is there any truth to that? So when we talk about this truism, what we're talking about is the idea of complementarity, or the notion that people in relationships tend to be drawn to people that have something that they themselves lack. research says that similarity is more important to people generally than complementarity is, and that similarity among partners leads to more attraction and higher relationship quality and satisfaction in the long term. However, there are some situations where complementarity does hold true. So there are certain traits for which people do tend to seek out people that are dissimilar to them. So for example, among straight people, men who are highly masculine tend to prefer women who are highly feminine, and vice versa, right? So that's an example of complementarity. Additionally, people who are socially domineering tend to prefer partners who are more socially submissive, and also vice versa. So again, there are these various traits where complementarity does seem to hold, or this desire for complementarity seems to hold. People seeking out short-term relationships also tend to prefer dissimilar others, so people who are not similar to them. When people are looking for short-term relationship partners, it doesn't matter so much if their personalities or their values don't jive that well. More often, people seeking short-term relationships are drawn to people who are not like them in various ways, because someone who is dissimilar is going to be seen as more novel and exciting compared to someone who is highly similar, right? So this question also, or like one of the caveats of this question is like, what kind of relationship are we talking about? Are we talking about attraction in a long-term relationship or a short-term relationship? If we're talking about a long-term relationship, then similarity is going to be more important than complementarity. But perhaps it's the other way around for shorter-term relationships. So, bottom line, which of these two common sayings is the true one? The answer is that they both do have some truth to them. It just depends on the situation. Again, like the answer to every question in psychology, the answer is it depends. So earlier, we've been talking about reasons for why the things people say they want in a partner don't always line up with the kind of partner they end up with, or the kind of partner that they end up being most attracted to. An additional reason for this, or why this may be, beyond like the situational variables we just talked about, is because there are certain things people might value, but maybe don't want to admit to valuing because those reasons aren't seen as socially acceptable. So for example, like physical attractiveness. Few people will say physical attractiveness is something that's really important to them because honestly, it seems kind of shallow to say that, right? But physical attractiveness does play a big role in how attracted we are to people. It really does have an effect. So for example, there was a study done by Hatfield and colleagues where they took a bunch of new first-year undergraduates at the start of a semester, and they randomly matched them up for like a welcome week date night. And so each of these participants was randomly matched up with another first year, and after a 3-hour-long date, the only factor that accurately predicted how well each of the students felt like their date was going was how physically attractive their partner was. Right? So nothing else mattered. Their personality didn't matter in this case. Their beliefs and attitudes didn't matter. The quality of the conversation didn't matter. It just boiled down to how attractive is this person. Other studies not involving romantic partners have also found similar effects. So physically attractive political candidates are more likely to win elections than unattractive candidates. Or think back to when we talked about persuasion and what makes a person more persuasive. The attractiveness of a person delivering a persuasive message tends to make people more likely to agree with that speaker. Recall balance theory is something that we talked about in that context. So something worth noting, physical attractiveness tends to be more important to people early on in a relationship, like when we're talking about relationship formation and attractiveness, physical attractiveness tends to be more important early on. Reason being that when you're first getting to know someone, you don't know a whole lot about them in terms of their personality or their values or their beliefs. Those things take time to learn about, often lots of time. But physical attractiveness is something that we can assess about a person in as little as 1/6 of a second. We can gauge it extremely quickly. The other stuff takes much, much more time to learn about. As a result, physical attractiveness does tend to strongly influence our first impressions about a person. As we do learn about someone else's personality and so forth, though, those factors do become more important in deciding how much we like that person or whether we want to continue our relationship with that person. So over time in a relationship, physical attractiveness seems to become less important in determining how much someone likes their partner. Early on, though, it makes a big difference. Also, another point here is that attractiveness can be subjective to a certain extent. So, for example, we just talked about the mere exposure effect. People tend to find faces that they've been exposed to really frequently to be more attractive on average than faces that they're unfamiliar with. Right? So there is some level of subjectivity here. Now, we tend to like attractive people more than unattractive people. For better or for worse, this is a tendency seen across people. It's also an effect that extends into how we evaluate people in various ways. So the halo effect. The halo effect refers to a general tendency to assume that someone who has one positive attribute also has other positive attributes, even if we don't have direct evidence for those other positive attributes. When it's applied to physical attraction, this is also called the beautiful is good stereotype. It's an assumption that physically attractive people are better than unattractive people in more ways than just how good looking they are. So there's a general tendency to assume that people who are physically attractive are more intelligent, happier in their lives, more successful, higher in self-esteem, kinder, more socially skilled, more likable, and so forth, compared to unattractive people. It's like this one quality about a person, just how good looking they are, influences our evaluation about these other qualities that we really have no idea about. They may or may not be happier than an unattractive person or more successful and so on, right? It's stereotyping essentially based on this one quality that we can see in them. And this stereotype is something that is strongly reinforced by our culture. So in the media, think about how many heroes or good characters are portrayed as extremely attractive, extremely handsome or beautiful, while bad or evil characters are almost always like really ugly, really unattractive, right? So the media reinforces this stereotype that we have. Often, the halo effect results in incorrect assessments of people. So it's not necessarily the case that good-looking people are inherently better in all of these ways compared to unattractive people. However, kind of interestingly enough, physically attractive people do tend to be more socially skilled and have better social outcomes than unattractive people. That is something that we can measure, assess, and see to be true on average. Think about why that might be. Because people tend to prefer attractive people to unattractive people tend to treat attractive people better than they tend to treat unattractive people. Because they're biased, again, to like attractive people more than unattractive people. And that's something that's been demonstrated, sadly, in several studies. So for example, in one study where participants were asked to evaluate an essay and assign it a grade, they tended to give a more highly positive rating when they believed that the essay was written by an attractive person, compared to when that same essay was supposedly written by an unattractive person. So when you're consistently treated nicely throughout your life, you're probably going to develop better social skills and have better social outcomes as a result. So those positive things, being more socially skilled and having better social outcomes, they may not represent an inherent difference between attractive people and unattractive people. It may just be a result of a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So on the subject of physical attractiveness, what is it exactly that people find physically attractive? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That's something we hear a lot. And there is some truth to it. There are major differences between people regarding what they find physically attractive or unattractive. But research suggests that across people, there is a fairly strong consensus about what it is they find attractive. For example, facial symmetry tends to be seen as something fairly attractive across people. So physical attraction, it matters, but does it matter to some people more than others? The answer appears to be yes. So we see gender differences about the importance of physical attractiveness. So this is from a study that asked men and women, trying to be as honest as you can, are you more attracted to people by their bodies or by their brains? That was the question that was asked. Comparing men and women on average, men tended to be more likely to report that physical attractiveness was more important to them in selecting a partner. Women tended to report placing a much higher emphasis on brains over body compared to men. And then back to this question of what people specifically find attractive, we also seem to see some gender differences here as well, right? So again, facial symmetry is one thing. That's something we mentioned earlier. What else, though? There's obviously a whole lot of variation in what people find physically attractive, but research suggests that generally, heterosexual men tend to report preferring partners who have these sorts of features above. So they tend to report preferring partners with large eyes, full lips, prominent cheekbones. They also prefer younger partners and partners with a 0.7 waist to hip ratio, or kind of like an hourglass figure. From an evolutionary perspective, the reason why men tend to desire these qualities in their mates is because they're all signs of fertility. All of these qualities suggest sexual maturity and youthfulness. So the younger a sexually mature partner is, the more likely it is that she will be fertile. Women with a waist to hip ratio near that attractiveness norm of 0.7 are actually more likely to have a particular mix of hormones, estradiol and progesterone, that allows them to become pregnant more easily. So they do seem to be more fertile in that way. The wider a woman's hips are in relation to her waist, it's also a good indication that she's, again, more fertile and healthy. Studies of waist to hip ratio preferences, the way that those sorts of studies are done, they'll present people with a diagram that looks something like this above, and subjects will be asked to pick which figures they find most attractive. And it's not always a cartoon like this. Oftentimes pictures of real women will be used. As it turns out, interestingly enough, a person's weight has less of an influence on attractiveness than their waist to hip ratio does. So waist to hip ratio seems to matter more to people in terms of attractiveness than that person's weight does. And similar studies have also been done looking at male attractiveness. So those sorts of studies will present people with figures like this, and they'll ask them which figure they find most attractive in terms of like a waist to hip ratio. On average, in this case, when it comes to male attractiveness, the magic number seems to be 0.9 waist to hip ratio, which is kind of like a more V-shaped figure. In addition to that, heterosexual women tend to find things like having a broad forehead, a strong jaw, a deeper voice, being taller, and being somewhat older as more attractive traits in men. Evolutionary psychologists will argue that these tend to be preferences for women because over the long course of evolutionary history, women look to their partners to provide resources and protection. And so all of these are like signals of strength, essentially. Let me go back to So think about being a woman 20,000 years ago, before civilization was a thing, back when people lived in really small packs in a fairly dangerous environment. Imagine living in that landscape and not only being a woman, but being a pregnant woman. It would be really difficult to survive in that state and ensure that your offspring is delivered and also survives without some kind of assistance from a group or from a partner. And so seeking out a mate who can successfully provide that kind of assistance would have been imperative. Now, obviously, there are some limits to the evolutionary perspective on attraction. Let's talk about some of those limits. So number one, although the evolutionary perspective may explain each gender's average preferences, average tendencies, it does not explain the wide variability of preferences. So not all men are attracted to women who have these qualities. Not all men are attracted to women, period. Similarly, not all women are attracted to men who look like this, or even men in general. Another related issue is that the evolutionary perspective doesn't account for the ways that society and culture have shaped people's preferences. So the evolutionary perspective says that women tend to be attracted to partners who can provide for them. And speaking generally, when you look the broader scope of things, women do tend to prefer that more than men do. However, culture plays a really big role in how highly women tend to value things like their partner's ability to provide for them, or their partner's wealth and status, and so forth. So in societies where there is high gender inequity, so we're talking about places where women are not afforded the same rights as men, they don't have access to the same resources, they can't easily gain wealth on their own, or they can't enter a career that has the same, they can't enter high status careers or even have a career at all in some cases. In those sorts of societies, women do tend to strongly prefer partners with wealth and status. That matters more strongly to women in those sorts of societies. However, in societies with more gender equity, in which women are paid as much as men are, occupy the same careers as men, can gain the same kind of wealth and status that men do, in those sorts of societies, their potential partner's wealth and status tends not to matter as much to women. They still make some difference, but not nearly as much compared to those other cultures where gender inequity is the norm. So the evolutionary perspective, it doesn't really take findings like that into consideration. Also, we're again talking about physical attractiveness. Physical attractiveness is really just one factor in terms of whether or not someone is going to be attracted to a person. Personality, beliefs, and values definitely do make a difference in relationship quality and in relationship satisfaction in the long run. Also, all of this research, at least a majority of it, is based on self-report data. What that means is, as we've discussed before, we're talking about explicit attitudes, explicit preferences, right? What people report themselves. These explicit preferences, for a variety of reasons may or may not reflect people's implicit preferences. So just things to consider when we're talking about the evolutionary perspective. So we're just talking about general gender differences in attraction. A lot of research in this area has been done on heterosexual men and heterosexual women. But in recent years, in recent decades, there has been more and more research on members of the LGBT community. So let's talk just a little bit about this domain of research. So interestingly, among gay and lesbian men and women, we do see a lot of similarities in the findings about attraction relationships that we see among straight people. So here are just a few of the findings related to gender differences in attraction. So the finding that more men compared to women report their partner's physical attractiveness as being important to them is true for both gay men and women too. So gay men tend to place more emphasis on their partner's physical attractiveness than lesbian or straight women do. These sorts of similarities notwithstanding, there are some differences in what gay men and women find attractive in their partners. So again, we're talking about general tendencies. This doesn't describe all gay men and women, but again, general tendencies. So on average, gay men tend to prefer other men who are more masculine in nature and who occupy more masculine roles in society. That's what research suggests. In contrast, gay women tend to look for partners with more feminine characteristics, although they're not necessarily looking as strongly for people who occupy feminine social roles. Now, in addition to that, in terms of the physique that gay men and women are attracted to, it tends to be less close to, or rather, sorry, we're just talking about gay women here. It tends to be less close to the thin ideal promoted by the media and that is preferred by straight men. Broadly speaking, that finding is consistent with the notion that women's views on what is physically attractive about a partner of either sex are more flexible than men's views are. So that's a lot of information about physical attractiveness, physical attraction. Now let's move one step further and talk about romantic relationships. So why do people form romantic relationships? Why do they stay in them? What makes for a satisfying relationship? And we'll start by taking an emotional perspective. So let's talk about love. One big reason why people form and maintain relationships is because of love. Love is considered by many to be the most important human emotion. It's characterized by a deep emotional connection between two people, typically but not always involving some sexual attraction. Love is associated with attachment, caring, and intimacy. Over the years, there have been a number of different psychological theories and models that attempt to explain the reasons for love and the experiences of love. So we're going to be spending time talking about one of those models. It's one of the more descriptive models out there, and that is Sternberg's triangular model of love. So the nice thing about this model is that it is really descriptive. It explains like different components or like flavors of love depending on how much of each of these ingredients is included within a relationship. So there's 3 different basic components here to love. The first component is intimacy. Intimacy, as we've defined it previously, it's defined as the familiarity and kind of a high level of self-disclosure between partners. So to be intimate with someone is to know them really well. Whoops. Just close out of my PowerPoint here. Okay, there we go. Passion refers to sexual attraction and desire between two people. Oops. Sorry about that. Okay, and we're back. Are we back? We're close to being back. Okay, and we're back. All right. So passion refers to sexual attraction or desire. And then finally, the last component of this model is commitment. So commitment refers to an investment of time, energy, and resources into a relationship. So the kind of love that a person has for another depends on how much of these three components they have with, between two people. So if two people have low levels of all three of these components toward each other, you might consider that to be non-love. Right? That's like a lack of love. If all you have is intimacy in a relationship, so let's say you have a relationship that is high in intimacy but low in passion and commitment, that's friendship, right? That's platonic love. You know one another well. There's a lot of disclosure going on, but you don't have sexual desire for one another, nor are you heavily committed to one another, as you might be with a more like romantic partner. If you have passion alone, if all you have is passion in a relationship, you could consider that to be pure infatuation, right? So really strong desire, strong sexual attraction, but no familiarity or shared commitment. You could think of like puppy love or having a crush on someone you don't know quite well. That's infatuation. And if intimacy or commitment do not develop in that kind of relationship, it can quickly die out. Right? It can quickly fizzle out. If you have commitment alone, so a relationship that is high in commitment but low in intimacy and passion, that's called empty love. A relationship in which both people are, again, highly committed to one another, but not very intimate or familiar or passionate or desirous toward one another. You could think of like two people in a married relationship who things have kind of fallen apart, but they're still staying together because they have kids, and they're really only together because of those kids, right? So there's a level of commitment there, although not anything else. That's empty love. Empty love doesn't always necessarily signal the end of a relationship or that things are going poorly. It could happen at the beginning of a relationship. So think about cultures in which arranged marriages are common. You have two people who are committed to one another, right? They're married, they are legally committed to one another, but they're not yet passionate or totally intimate with one another. They may start out with empty love, but that could potentially grow into a fuller kind of love. So then beyond all that, this model says that these different love ingredients can be combined to form other types of love. For example, when you combine passion and intimacy, you get what's called romantic love. This is love involving two partners who have a lot of sexual desire toward one another and high self-disclosure or like intimacy, but low commitment. So you might think of an ongoing romantic affair, right? That would be an example of romantic love. There's not a strong level of commitment there, even if there is high intimacy and passion. So that's romantic love. Passionate and committed love is known as fatuous love. It's characterized by really high passion and commitment, but low intimacy, low self-disclosure, a low level of familiarity with one another. So you could think about whirlwind relationships that escalate really, really quickly. So think of like two people who meet and it's love at first sight and they get married within weeks, even though, a few weeks or like a month really isn't all that much time to get to know one another super, super well. So there are people who are high in passion and commitment, but relatively low in intimacy. You could think of Romeo and Juliet, right? They were incredibly infatuated with one another. There was a lot of passion between them, and they were also incredibly committed to one another, to the point that they were willing to, spoiler alert, die for one another. Reality was, though, they didn't know that much about one another. They only had, I think 2 or 3 meetings together. So they had fatuous love. High in commitment and passion, but low in intimacy. Intimacy and commitment together make companionate love. Companionate love is an intimate, non-passionate form of love that is stronger than friendship because it involves strong commitment, but there's no passion or sexual desire there. So typically you see this in many very long-term marriages, or you might think of the love that you have for your family members, your mom, your dad, your siblings. That would be considered companionate love. Again, very high in intimacy or self-disclosure, high in commitment, you're very committed to one another, just low in passion. Now finally, when a relationship has each of these 3 components, high intimacy, high commitment, high passion, you get what is called consummate love. This type of love is the hardest to find. It's the most challenging to maintain in the long term. However, it is characterized by the best relationship outcomes, according to Sternberg. The really high relationship satisfaction, the longest lasting marriages, and so forth. So that is the triangular model of love, and the many, many different types of love that come out of it. We refer to a lot of different things as love in our many relationships in life, right? We love our parents, we love our siblings, our friends, our romantic partners, and they're all slightly different in various ways. So the nice thing about this model is that it explains exactly what those differences in love are. Any questions about anything we've been talking about thus far, please feel free to post them in the chat. All right, let's look at one more model as it relates to intimate relationships. So another reason that people form and maintain relationships is because there are certain benefits to having a partner in life. Right? And in happy relationships, those benefits outweigh the potential costs, right? Because with any relationship, there are costs and benefits. Hopefully the benefits outweigh the costs. So the social exchange model takes on an economic approach to understanding and describing relationships. The underlying assumption here is that people approach relationships with a motivation of self-interest, a kind of what's in this for me mentality. And people are constantly weighing the costs and benefits of being in a particular relationship. Not just romantic relationships, but really any relationship in life. So think about what some of the benefits that come with entering in we'll use romantic relationship as an example. What are some of the benefits you might get from a romantic relationship? What are some good things you can get out of a romantic relationship? Happiness is one of them. Self-esteem, right? You could derive self-esteem from being in a really healthy partnership. Other positive emotions. You have someone you get social support from. Maybe you get some financial gains there, right? So those are some good things associated with entering in a relationship. Maybe some potential costs on the other side. Things like time and energy. There's a chance that you might experience some negative emotions. Maybe your career, your job is sacrificed in some way due to who you are with romantically. Maybe there's some financial expenses with that relationship that you didn't have otherwise, right? So it's all about weighing these costs and these benefits. Now, clearly, this is not the most romantic way to look at relationships, but it does make some sense. So relationships, they have ups and downs, And as long as the ups outweigh the downs, people tend to be fairly happy and content and remain in those relationships. Nice thing about this model is that it presents us with an equation of relationship satisfaction. So like how to calculate relationship satisfaction. So the way it works is relationship satisfaction is calculated by subtracting your perceived costs from your perceived benefits in a relationship, or your perceived rewards. And then from that, you subtract your comparison level. Now, your comparison level refers to your expectations of how rewarding a relationship should be, right? So it's your ideas of like, what should a relationship give me or look like? And comparison levels can differ widely from person to person. So some people have much higher standards than others do when it comes to relationships. So maybe you have someone, maybe you know someone who, like, they grew up watching a lot of Disney movies and they've really internalized this idea that their soulmate exists somewhere out there. And if they're in a relationship with someone and that person is not making them 100% absolutely happy 100% of the time, then you know what? That means that person is not their soulmate and they shouldn't be with that person, right? Really high standards. That person would be said to have a very high comparison level. They have very high standards. Even if the rewards outweigh the costs in that relationship, it might not be good enough for this person to be satisfied. So they might still be unsatisfied in that case. But let's say that you have someone who does not have those high expectations. Maybe there's someone who is fairly easygoing and patient, just naturally. Or maybe there's someone who grew up in a home where their parents argued and fought a lot. So their reference for what a typical relationship looks like was not that great. Their comparison level might be far lower than that first hypothetical person. Right? So as long as they get along with their partner, right, as long as their costs don't totally outweigh their rewards, they'll probably be satisfied in that relationship. Now, one weakness of this model is that it assumes that selfish benefits are the only driving force in a relationship, which is not necessarily true, obviously. Right? If this model were all that there was to relationships, then that means that the two people in a couple would be driven to put in the least amount of effort, right? The least amount of cost into the relationship while simultaneously trying to get as much as they can out of the other person or out of the relationship, right? So like maximize rewards, minimize costs. And that's not always the case, right? Hopefully that's not the case with you or your romantic partner. Sometimes people are motivated to willingly make great sacrifices for their partners. This model doesn't explain that. So how might we explain those people or those sorts of relationships? Well, you will have to wait until next class to find out, because we're going to pause here and start the Kahoot quiz. So again, if you have any questions about anything we've covered thus far, please feel free to post in the chat or send me an email. All right, let's see if I can switch to Kahoot without everything messing up on me. All right. So we're going to start here. There is the code. Code is 357771. As always, please join with your first and last name as your nickname. If you do not join with your first and last name as your nickname, I won't be able to tell who you are, and this won't count for those very, very valuable extra credit points. And if that's not important to you, then that's okay too. give it another minute. People log in. Here. I think this might be everyone we're going to get. It's okay. All right, let's start her up. So 4 questions covering the last week. So first question, the perception that you are less well off than others with whom you compare yourself is referred to as, is it displacement? Is it relative deprivation? Is it social learning? Or is it the frustration-aggression hypothesis? The perception that you're less well off than others with whom you compare yourself. Recall, this touches on one of the theories we talked about when we talked about aggression. Yes, majority of you got it right. Relative deprivation is the perception that you're less well off than others with whom you compare yourself. Very good job. All right, next question. Arousal, physiological arousal caused by one event leading to intense emotional reactions to another event is called, is it the fundamental attribution error? Is it hostile attribution bias? Is it psychological projection? Or is it excitation transfer? Arousal caused by one event leading to intense emotional reactions to some other potentially unrelated event. What is it? Okay, see a little bit of spread here. We're talking about excitation transfer here. When you're highly aroused by some event, like maybe drinking that cup of coffee, and then maybe you attribute that excitement that you felt from that caffeine to something else you're doing. Like I think the example was like watching some game on TV or something. It's also referred to as misattribution of arousal, excitation transfer. You can find that in the slides on aggression. All right, next question. The tendency to believe that physically attractive people are smart, warm, and friendly is called what? Is it the mere exposure effect? Is it the matching phenomenon? Is it the halo effect? Or is it prejudicial comparison? The tendency to believe that physically attractive people are smarter, warmer, and friendlier than physically unattractive people. Okay, most of you got it. Yes, it is the halo effect, or I should say it's an example of the halo effect. Okay, last question. Which of the following best describes the concept of complementarity? Is it seeking out a romantic partner who has traits that are similar to your own? Or is it seeking out a partner with traits that you lack? Or is it seeking out a partner who is highly agreeable? Or is it seeking out a partner who matches your level of physical attractiveness? Which of those best describes the concept of complementarity? Again, majority of you got it right. Yes, complementarity is when you seek out a partner with traits that you yourself lack. So it's kind of the whole idea behind opposites attract. That's complementarity. So great job to everyone. Here are again the arbitrary winners of the Kahoot. So congrats to Chile. Good work. You have ended Patrick's End of Terror, previous 2-time winner. All right, great job. I will see you on Tuesday for our last week of classes. It's sad. All right, take care, and I will see you then.